Welcome to Economic Frontiers, the podcast where we break down complex economic issues affecting everyday people. I'm Sarah Chen, your host, and today we're tackling a topic that's been on everyone's mind lately, inflation. Is it truly out of control? And what does it mean for your wallet? To help us understand the economic causes and real-world impacts, I'm joined by Dr. James Wilson, professor of economics at Riverside University and author of Modern Monetary Pressures. Welcome to the show, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. It's great to be here to discuss such a timely and important issue affecting so many Americans.
Let's start with some context. According to recent data from the Labor Department, the annual inflation rate hit 2.9% in August 2025, up from 2.7% in July. This continues what's been a bit of a roller coaster over the past few years. So, Dr. Wilson, what's driving this current inflation trend?
That's right, Sarah. While 2.9% isn't anywhere near the alarming peaks of 9% we saw back in 2022, it's still above the Federal Reserve's target rate of 2%. What's interesting about our current inflation situation is that it's driven by multiple factors working simultaneously. If we look at the data, housing costs are contributing significantly. About 3/5 of the overall inflation rate is coming from shelter costs. We're also seeing price pressures in food, which was up 3.2% in August compared to last year.
I think many of our listeners can relate to seeing those higher grocery bills. But I'm curious about the deeper economic causes. Is this primarily a supply side or demand side issue?
It's actually a fascinating mix of both, which is what makes addressing inflation so challenging. On the supply side, we're still dealing with some lingering supply chain disruptions, though they've improved dramatically since the pandemic peaks. Energy prices have been volatile, but started to tick up again recently. Natural gas prices specifically have remained elevated, up 13% over the last year.
And what about the demand side of the equation?
On the demand side, we've had a combination of factors. Consumer spending has remained relatively strong, though we're starting to see signs of it softening. Some economists argue that the significant government spending during the pandemic, while absolutely necessary for preventing a depression, did contribute to inflationary pressures by increasing the money supply and boosting demand at a time when supply was constrained.
You know, inflation can feel very abstract when we discuss it in terms of percentages and economic theory. Let's make this more concrete for our listeners. How is this inflation actually impacting everyday consumers?
You're absolutely right to bring us back to the human impact. Research shows that many consumers are adapting their behaviors in response to persistent inflation. For example, nearly half of consumers report making or planning cutbacks in their general expenditures. We're seeing more people prioritize essential purchases over discretionary ones, and many are shifting from premium brands to more affordable store brand alternatives.
I've definitely noticed that shift in my own shopping habits. The generic brand pasta is suddenly looking a lot more appealing.
Exactly, and this is a widespread phenomenon. Market data shows that private label or store brand products are gaining market share after years of decline. In Europe, own brand penetration has actually exceeded pre-pandemic levels in many food categories. We're talking significant increases in categories like ice cream, yogurt, and soups. In the U.S., while private label share remains below pre-COVID levels overall, we're seeing gains in nearly 30 out of 47 key categories, particularly in hygiene products, bottled waters, and baby food.
That's fascinating. And what about the impact on household budgets more broadly? Are some groups of people feeling this inflation more than others?
This is where it gets really interesting, Sarah. Research from Stanford University suggests that the impact of inflation actually depends significantly on what's causing it. When inflation is primarily driven by energy price shocks, like oil supply disruptions, it tends to hurt lower-income households more severely. These households typically spend a larger percentage of their income on essentials like fuel and heating.
And that makes intuitive sense. When gas prices spike, it hits harder if you're already stretching your budget.
Absolutely. But in contrast, when inflation is driven by monetary factors, like expansionary policies from the Federal Reserve, the research suggests it actually impacts more affluent households more severely. This is primarily because monetary policy affects asset prices, like stocks and housing, which hurts younger people trying to buy homes or build investment portfolios.
That's a really important distinction that I think often gets lost in the inflation conversation. You mentioned the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about their role. They've been pretty active in trying to manage inflation over the past few years, right?
Yes, the Fed has been walking a tightrope. After keeping rates near zero during the pandemic, they aggressively raised interest rates to combat the inflation surge of 2022 to 2023. More recently, they've begun cutting rates again, with a significant cut just last month. Their challenge is balancing inflation control with maintaining employment levels.
For our listeners who might not be as familiar with monetary policy, can you explain how exactly raising interest rates helps combat inflation?
Of course. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive for both businesses and consumers. This generally leads to decreased spending throughout the economy. Businesses invest less in expansion, consumers purchase fewer big-ticket items like houses and cars, and this overall reduction in demand helps ease price pressures.
But that approach comes with trade-offs, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The major concern is that raising rates too aggressively can slow economic growth to the point of causing a recession. Higher rates mean higher borrowing costs for businesses, which can lead to reduced hiring or even layoffs. This is why you often hear about the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. They're constantly balancing these two objectives.
Let's go back to the consumer level for a moment. I've heard people debate whether inflation is transitory versus more permanent. Where do we stand on that question now in 2025?
That's a great question, and one that economists have been debating intensely. The initial surge in inflation after the pandemic was clearly driven by some temporary factors: supply chain disruptions, pent-up demand, and pandemic-related spending. But some structural factors remain in place. Housing shortages continue to push up shelter costs, climate change is affecting food prices, and labor market dynamics have shifted.
So it sounds like a mix of both temporary and more persistent forces.
Exactly. What we're seeing now is that headline inflation has moderated significantly from its peak, but certain categories remain stubborn. Core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, was at 3.1% in August, still above the Federal Reserve's target rate.
We're about halfway through our conversation, and I'd like to shift to some practical advice. Many of our listeners are feeling the squeeze of higher prices. What strategies can everyday consumers use to cope with this inflation environment?
The first step is being intentional about your spending. Review your budget and identify areas where you might cut back on non-essentials. Consider those store brands we mentioned earlier. They often provide similar quality at lower prices.
Any thoughts on bigger financial decisions in this environment?
If you're carrying variable rate debt like credit card balances or adjustable rate mortgages, this is a good time to work on paying those down or refinancing to fixed rates when possible. On the investment side, make sure your portfolio is diversified and includes some inflation-resistant assets. Historically, certain sectors like consumer staples, healthcare, and utilities have been more resilient during inflationary periods.
That's helpful advice. Now, looking forward, what's your outlook for inflation for the remainder of 2025 and beyond?
Based on current data and trends, I expect inflation to remain somewhat elevated through the end of 2025, potentially ending the year around 3.4%, before moderating further in 2026. The Federal Reserve will likely continue with modest rate cuts, balancing inflation concerns against employment data. The recent jobs report showed some weakening in the labor market, which will likely influence their decisions.
Are there any potential risks that could push inflation higher again?
Several key risks bear watching. Energy prices remain vulnerable to geopolitical tensions. The implementation of new tariffs could push consumer prices higher. And there's always the possibility that monetary policy could be too accommodative, allowing inflation to accelerate. Recent research from the Richmond Federal Reserve highlights how difficult it is to disentangle these various inflation causes, which makes predicting their future path challenging.
As we wrap up our discussion, Dr. Wilson, what's the most important takeaway about inflation that you'd like our listeners to understand?
I think the key insight is that inflation isn't a monolithic force. Its causes and effects vary across different segments of the economy and different groups of people. This means that policy responses need to be nuanced and targeted. And for consumers, it means that adapting to inflation may require different strategies depending on your specific circumstances.
That's a really valuable perspective. Looking beyond individual consumers, what do you think policymakers should be focusing on to address inflation more effectively?
Policymakers need to take a multifaceted approach. Monetary policy is important, but has limitations. We also need to address supply-side constraints, things like housing shortages, energy transition challenges, and workforce development. And importantly, we need targeted support for the most vulnerable households who are disproportionately impacted by rising prices of necessities.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been an illuminating discussion about the causes and impacts of inflation.
It's been my pleasure, Sarah. These economic issues can seem abstract, but they have very real effects on people's daily lives, so I appreciate the opportunity to break them down.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on Economic Frontiers. If you found this discussion valuable, please subscribe to our podcast for more in-depth analysis of the economic issues that matter to you. Next week, we'll be exploring the changing landscape of retirement planning in an uncertain economic environment. Until then, I'm Sarah Chen, and this has been Economic Frontiers.